amongst the youth of the ANC and in general felt a more physical pull in terms of the kind of struggle they wanted to basically fight. Not exactly something that was militant at that point in time, but just something that the population could see and feel. As a result, you find Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu went on to reform the ANC in that basic light. Robert Sobukwe, you'll find, was different in that in 1959 he broke away and he established something called the Pan-Africanist Congress in that year. Now, he was established as the organization's first president. But you find that what came about is that what most organizations found as their first stumbling block was that government controlled most forms of media, radios, newspapers. So it was very difficult to get a message across to the entire nation. So you find when marches was organized, it usually would be a march in isolation essentially, and would be quashed in isolation itself. You find that Robert Sobukwe was described as a man that was highly charismatic, but at the same time very well organized. So on the 21st of March of 1960, he called for a stand to be made against something called the pass law system. Now, to understand this law, it says that a black South African is not a full South African citizen. They must carry passbooks at all times. It states where you can live, where you can work, what time you're allowed to be in areas. Caught in an area and you don't have a passbook in your possession, they charge you what is the equivalent of 3 months' salary. If you cannot pay that fine, which most people could not, you could face up to a 6-month term of imprisonment, in some cases without trial. So Robert Sobukwe then says, burn the passbook and leave the law null and void. Have so many protesters that you do not have enough prisons to actually accommodate. Now, it sounds like a very simple thing to do, but take into account, no media can be used. At the same time, take into account just one person's basic mental shift. That one person is considering that this is no normal demonstration, because if they are unsuccessful, you don't just simply turn around and go home. You will be arrested, and you will see your family a minimum of 6 months later. This is an all-or-nothing basic operation. As a result, you'll find to convince that one person to do so would be remarkable. To try and convince almost an entire nation to do so, you required numbers. That was considered impossible. But you'll find with no normal forms of media, that march was brought about as one of the largest of that time. Because what was forgotten is that people that would work at the back of trucks, who would basically be used as your packaging personnel, removing and basically packing trucks, would be at the back of those trucks when they would go from one province to the next. So they would not just be the couriers of goods, they would be the couriers of information as well. Now, something that is, I don't know if it's distinctly South African, but even up and until today in South Africa, that you have the kind of atmosphere that you can start a demonstration by just walking down one street, telling one neighbor. That neighbor tells the next neighbor. And by the time that you end off in that street, you have the entire population of that street behind you. And you the next street, and so forth and so on. That basic motion, that basic momentum, was used to bring about marches nationwide. You find it was not the entire nation that stood up in protest yet, but it was enough to make the apartheid government sit up and take notice. What they decided, unfortunately, on that date was not to abolish the law. They did not directly intervene in any of those demonstrations, because that was their course of action that they chose. Because you'll find the consequences of inaction on that date would definitely lead to violence. The question might be brought up, how exactly, what do I mean by that statement? You find you take into account just one location. One police station has less than 40 police officers, heavily armed. They are being surrounded by several hundred to several thousand protesters in total. It does not take much in terms of mistakes being made to lead to the loss of life. Now you add on to that they have no instruction from above. They have no direction on what they are supposed to be doing. So you find that they are left to feel isolated and alone. You find panic will eventually erupt, and a slight mistake will lead to bloodshed itself. You find a warning shot will be fired on one side of a building. Already panicked police officers on the other side will not confirm that shot as they would in normal circumstances. They will just simply open fire. By the time they bring about calm, people have already lost their lives. The sad thing about it is that it does not just happen in one location. It repeats itself over and over again. You find different mistakes, but the same result. By the time the day was over, few South Africans even remembered that a march had even taken place. What was remembered is the lives lost on that date, and that is exactly what the apartheid government wanted. They wanted to set an example of what would happen to anyone that opposed their rule. You find that what comes about today is that one town from that march was specifically remembered. One location stood out in world history, and that is simply because it was not just a simple act of panic that brought about the bloodshed at that station. Because when the bodies was viewed, it was discovered that the majority of those shot and killed was actually found to have been shot in their backs. Now, simple logic says the only way you get shot in your back is if you're facing away from the person firing on you. Take into account the number of people that were shot. The only possible basic conclusion is that that crowd was already in flight when police opened fire. That is not an act of panic. That is a conscious decision to gun down someone that poses you no threat. As a result, people around the world woke up to news articles with that town's name as its headline. And the day itself was remembered by that town's name as the Sharpeville Massacre in total. It is what set the wheel in motion in terms of international pressure. It basically put South Africa's name on the map itself. People started taking note about what the government of that time was doing from that day onwards. For Robert Sobukwe, unfortunately, it marked his last day of freedom, because the government would never again underestimate this man. They had come to know of this march that was supposedly to have taken place, but they expected a turnout of 1 or 2 towns as a maximum, not a nationwide demonstration. They had underestimated him once. They would never make that same mistake again. Robert Sobukwe would be imprisoned like no other person in South African history, because he was not just simply placed in a prison and made to serve a sentence. This man, in fact, did not have a sentence attached to him. He did not have a definite amount of time he would actually be spending in prison. Initially, they gave him a 3-year sentence under the charge of incitement. He completes it in Pretoria Maximum Security Prison. They officially release him. He walks out of that prison, and immediately outside, he's rearrested. He comes to discover that Parliament of that time, Parliament like anywhere else in the world that sits down to govern or pass laws and clauses that govern an entire nation, has passed the clause to govern one man's life, his own. The clause states that he can legally be detained for 12 months, renewed on an annual basis. You find essentially what that says in plain simple English. They never have to take him to trial. They never have to make a case against him. They can simply hold him in detention up and until the day he dies. And that is the direct intention of that clause itself. Because it is under that clause that he is introduced to the house on the left-hand side. And he is assigned a minimum of 6 hand-picked warders. 2 warders at a time, 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. These 6 warders have one main instruction: do not allow any communication between Robert Sobukwe and the outside world. That includes warders and prisoners passing by this area. You find the reason they are assigned 2 at a time is that one ward is watching Robert Sobukwe, while the second ward is actually watching the first warder, making sure there's no communication between that warder himself and this man. Everyone is to be treated with suspicion, so that when Robert Sobukwe dies, he dies in silence and isolation. He silently passes out of history. It would have been quite simple to simply have taken him out and simply killed him. But to do this is, you'll find, to kill a man whose name is known right around the nation, is to turn that man into a martyr. It is to immortalize his name. They cannot normally imprison him because he will have contact with the outside world. So isolation up and until the day he died was seen as the only way to rid themselves of the problem of Robert Sobukwe. For 6 years on this island, once a month he could see a reverend. Once every 6 months he could see his wife and family under controlled circumstances. Namely that he could only speak English, Afrikaans, languages a warder could understand. And he could only speak of the immediate family, his wife and children. He could not speak of family on the other side, he could not send messages to friends, and he could of course speak nothing of a political nature. The reason why his stay on this island lasted 6 years is the fact that he fell seriously ill and was diagnosed to be dying of cancer, at a time coinciding with international pressure building up on places like Robben Island. They now feared that this man's death under these conditions would become internationally known, and his name would be now known right around the world itself. To avoid that, they removed him off the island, but they did not release him. They just took him out of the public eye to a location called Khalishiwe, located just outside of Kimberley. And it was in that location he was kept under house arrest up and until the day he actually died in 1978 at the age of 54. The sad reality of Robert Sobukwe's life is not the way he was kept. It was not even the fact that he died before freedom was realized as a nation. Because every person that took up the fight against the apartheid government did so with the realization that the day might come where they might need to sacrifice their lives to bring about change. The sad fact is that Robert Sobukwe did not know that the sacrifice he was making would actually make a difference in our history. But the saddest fact of all is that the nation for which he sacrificed his life, in large, no longer remembers his name. To say this man's name in a public square with thousands of South Africans is to have a response by maybe 10 of those South Africans to actually know that name. Many a times in world history, not just in South African history itself, we view a fight for freedom like a relay race. We concentrate so much on the people that cross the finishing line that we forget about the people that actually built up to that finish itself. You find by all means, well, in all respect, I do basically say that everybody that we do remember today should be remembered with respect. But South Africa's freedom was not won by one person. You find Robert Sobukwe's contribution was not even known by himself. He did not know that the Sharpeville Massacre started the wheel of international pressure that eventually built into sanctions against the apartheid government, coupled with a fight happening in the nation itself, would be eventually what brings the apartheid government to its knees. What this man did not know in 1978 on his deathbed was that it was just 8 years after his death in 1986 that one of the first signs of change would be the abolishment of the pass law system itself, and it actually become one of the first major steps towards the dismantling of the apartheid regime. Ladies and gentlemen, is there any questions?